This is being written a few short hours after my departure from the hell on earth that was Peekskill, New York, this Sunday before Labor Day, 1949. I still hear the frenzied roar of crowds, the patter of stone against glass and flesh. I hear the wails of women, the impassioned screams of children, the jeers and taunts of wild-eyed youths. I still smell the sickening odor of blood flowing from freshly opened wounds, gasoline fumes from autos and buses valiantly trying to carry their loads of human targets out of the range of bricks, bottles, stones, sticks. I still feel the violence, the chaos which permeated the air. I still hear, smell, and feel Peekskill.
From the belly of the whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, and why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? The moon runs down in a purple stream, the sun refused to shine. Every star did disappear. Yes, freedom shall be mine. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man?
There's been the first bit of violence. I don't know who started it. Police have grabbed someone here. Police are pushing everyone back. Oh, this is terrible. Filling crowd is trying desperately to keep these people back. The police are fighting the cops, and they are beating up a Negro. They're beating up a cops are clubbing him. They're clubbing him.
Roughly 200 people were hospitalized for injuries sustained while leaving the concert. Countless more received private treatment. 16 cars were reported to have been overturned after their passengers had been chased or dragged out. More than 50 buses and countless cars had their windows smashed, tires cut up, and exteriors covered in dents, while serving as the only barrier of protection for their occupants. Despite the largest police force in the history of the region having been assembled by the governor to prevent any violence, they had failed before the eyes of the world. As news of what had happened began to circulate, the local newspaper responsible for spearheading the riots, the Peekskill Evening Star, would be put in the unique position of having to report on the events they had directly influenced. In their first issue after Labor Day, in the upper right-hand corner of the front page, the Evening Star would make their first response to the catastrophe that occurred in their backyard.
Good afternoon. The weatherman forecast rain for Sunday, but said nothing about rocks and stones.
Despite the large presence of law enforcement, only a handful of the attackers were arrested. 26 attackers were arrested by state police immediately after a trooper was struck by a rock. District Attorney George Finelli later said that the 26 would not be held. Four men were charged with malicious mischief with the specification that they overturned automobiles. This included Joseph Lillis Jr., whose father was the police chief for the city of Peekskill. He was released into the custody of his father soon after. 3 men were taken before a justice of the peace, whereupon they received suspended sentences for participating in the violence. Harold Davis, who had attempted to charge the concert grounds on horseback, was charged with third-degree assault for attacking the officers who had attempted to restrain him. For this, he was sentenced to 10 days, suspended for disorderly conduct. In the immediate aftermath of September 4th, 1949, those who had participated in the violence were given seemingly lenient treatment. The focus was instead turned to the sponsors, performers, and attendees of the Paul Robeson concert, and as news of the horrific events of that day spread, the blame for the violence would be placed on those who were the victims of it.
Peekskill's mayor would declare the blame rests solely on the Robesonites for insisting on coming to a community where they were unwelcome. Vincent Boyle, who had organized the protest parades, would also accuse Robeson of starting the riots.
I believe they incited the violence, since Robeson reported he would appear with his own protection of 3,000 stormtroopers, many of whom were armed with baseball bats and stones. The communist propaganda mill called our bluff, so to speak, and the veterans of our supporters took up the challenge. We will continue to demonstrate against Mr. Robeson's pseudo-concerts or any other subversive meetings. We do not want communists in this area, under any title or pretenses.
There was a feeling throughout the land that the communists would be taking over the United States. Someone had to draw the line. Someone had to say, you've gone this far, but no further. So we were proud of our actions. We were proud that at least we had the gumption to stand up against what we considered this communist infiltration into our area. There was a very famous bumper sticker at that time, as well as posters, and it said simply, "Wake up, America, Peekskill did." But we thought it was a damn good idea too, by the way.
The Associated Veterans Group would double down on its infamous slogan with a 2-page advertisement declaring, "Peekskill woke up, let's stay awake."
A few days after the riots, this newscast was heard.
The latest news bulletins. Governor Dewey has ordered a grand jury investigation of the disturbances which followed 2 recent Paul Robeson concerts near Peekskill. Dewey told reporters that the incidents were a disgrace. He charged that Robeson's communist followers had provoked the disorder. The governor added that the investigation will seek to determine whether the violence was the result of planning and whether the meeting itself was calculated to incite disorder. He said the inquiry would be complete and impartial.
Holy cow, it's unbelievable. A call for a complete and impartial investigation and a verdict, all in the same breath. Here is just a bit from the press, an editorial in the Peekskill Evening Star.
The editorial deplored Robeson's political opinions, said that every ticket purchased for the concert would drop nickels and dimes into the till basket of un-American political organizations. It concluded with these words: "The time for tolerant silence that signifies approval is running out."
And the radio did its bit too. Hour after hour and day after day, listeners were bombarded with this type of incitement.
Under the sponsorship of the People's Committee for the Benefit of the Harlem Branch of the Civil Rights Congress, listed by the government as a communist front, because of charges of left-wing activities of the Negro baritone.
Protest against Robeson's pro-Russian views. Pro-communist organization.
Dewey calls the concert a pro-communist meeting.
A pro-communist meeting.
however hateful the views by Paul Robeson, the Paratone author of a recent statement that American Negroes would not fight against Russia.
Subversive organization, subversive.
Governor Dewey directed Westchester County District Attorney George Finelli to open a grand jury investigation into the two riots. This was met with criticism, since Finelli had personally overseen the police response for the second concert, and therefore had a conflict of interest. Nevertheless, he was allowed to proceed. After 68 sessions and collecting the testimonies of 247 witnesses, the grand jury made its presentation public. The official legal conclusion on the Peekskill Riots would declare the following.
The grand jury is convinced that the violence, which developed on both occasions at the town of Cortland, was neither anti-Semitic nor anti-Negro in character. Despite the surface indications of racial and religious prejudice and some of the epithets hurled at the concertgoers, it is clear from the evidence that the fundamental cause of the resentment and focus of the hostility was communism.
Throughout the 35-page report, the grand jury asserted that communist elements were the primary instigator of the violence. The grand jury claimed that the coverage of racism and anti-Semitism in the riots was a part of the usual communist strategy in line with the official instructions laid down by Moscow. No evidence was presented to substantiate an alleged connection between Moscow and the concertgoers. Instead, the same rhetoric of anti-communist paranoia found in the headlines of local and national newspapers was rubber-stamped by state and county governments in the final pages of this report.
The grand jury doubts that the potential risk of having communist cells in Westchester County are fully appreciated by its residents. Community leaders and local organizations should undertake to make certain that ignorance regarding this movement is dispelled. In Westchester County, there are individuals and groups professing an alien ideology controlled by the absolute discipline of the Communist Party. Since the Communist Party is dedicated to the overthrow of the government by whatever means necessary, including violence, the grand jury is convinced that the presence of these communist groups in Westchester County constitutes a serious potential menace to the community. These strong armed forces, whose militant strength was revealed in the security guard at Cortland, must be recognized for what they are, the shock troops of a revolutionary force which is controlled by a foreign power and committed to methods and ultimate ends incompatible with our constitutional system.
Despite interviewing hundreds of victims, there is no mention of their experiences in the grand jury report. This is despite audiovisual documentation of the riots capturing countless attacks on the concertgoers. In the end, only 2 indictments would be handed up as a result of the grand jury investigation. One for an unidentified Peekskill resident charged with throwing a rock through a concertgoer's windshield. The other was for an unidentified New York resident charged with stabbing Navy veteran William Secor during the first of the 2 riots. While the first indicted Peekskill man was taken into custody, there is no evidence that the suspect in Secor's stabbing was ever apprehended, and their identity has never been revealed. The rioters were acquitted and the victims were vilified. Upon the release of the grand jury's report, the New York Times strongly commended what it believed to be a fair and moderate approach to the riots. As most mainstream reports on the Peekskill riots cover the perspective of anti-communism as the only factor in causing the riots, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, published their own investigation titled Violence in Peekskill. The 43-page report presents images alongside eyewitness testimony to document the violations of civil rights before, during, and after the 2 riots. Their investigation concluded by stating that the rioters believed they were carrying out a patriotic duty in what they did, but that they nevertheless deprived the concertgoers of their civil and constitutional rights. For the time, this was extremely bold, as it recognized that the veterans' racist and anti-Semitic acts were fueled by rhetoric sanctioned by the federal government, a stance that was often made by so-called subversive organizations and was therefore dismissed by mainstream outlets. Nevertheless, the mainstream view of the event still bled into the ACLU's report, as they felt the need to put a disclaimer at the beginning asserting that they did not align themselves with communists or any communist party. Before the publication of the pamphlet, the ACLU issued a statement denouncing efforts aimed at putting penalties upon political opinions, and they reached out to several public figures to endorse the statement. When they asked former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt to give her signature, she refused, taking issue with the fullest freedom of expression by communists to be protected along with all other American citizens. Despite this, she would make several public statements condemning the violence and deprivation of civil rights in Peekskill, while continuing to deplore communism and Paul Robeson.
Now that I have had time to read the results of all the efforts that were made to keep the peace at the concert given Sunday near Peekskill, and the amount of real harm that was done in spite of all the state police and local officers, I think that I must reiterate that it seems to me quite disgraceful to allow this kind of lawlessness. I dislike everything that Paul Robeson is now saying. I still believe, however, that if he wants to give a concert or speak his mind in public, no one should prevent him from doing so.
When President Harry Truman was asked to comment on the Peekskill riots, he stated simply, "Mrs. Roosevelt covered the situation perfectly and thoroughly." While she was far from the first to take this position, her influence on mainstream American society allowed a more liberal narrative on the riots to be distributed in the days and weeks afterwards. The discourse over the Peekskill riots and Paul Robeson would reach the floor of Congress on September 21st, when New York Congressman Jacob Javits deplored the violence before the House of Representatives.
Mr. Speaker, vigorous action by the state of New York, which has just resulted in the indictment of 6 participants in the Peekskill riot, should be gratifying to Americans everywhere. The local authorities are now having their opportunity, as they should, to demonstrate their ability to enforce the law and bring about respect for the Constitution. The issue is also a much wider one, affecting respect for constitutional guarantees to minorities throughout the United States, emphasizing that we expect it as much in the North as in the South. It reminds us that consideration of federal anti-lynching legislation has been permitted to lag in a way which is a disservice to the American people. There should be an overriding power in the federal government to see that beyond considerations of community, or even state, the Constitution is honored by all.
Mr. Speaker, it was not surprising to hear the gentleman from New York defend that communist conclave in New York where Paul Robeson, the nigger communist, sang the praises of Moscow and criticized the patriotic ex-servicemen who protested. The American people were not in sympathy with that gang of communists who composed that traitorous gathering.
Mr. Speaker, point of order. The gentleman will state it. The gentleman from Mississippi used the word nigger. I ask that that word be taken down and stricken from the record, inasmuch as there are 2 members in this House of the Negro race, and that word reflects on them.
I said Negro, just as I have said ever since I have been able to talk and shall continue to say.
The chair holds that the remarks of the gentleman from Mississippi are not subject to a point of order. He referred to the Negro race, and they should not be ashamed of that designation.
Threats began pouring into Paul Robeson's home in Enfield, Connecticut. Paul's wife, Essie, had an alarm system installed in their home after her attempts to purchase a firearm were denied by local police. She began sleeping with a hunting knife next to her pillow. Despite her husband seemingly standing in opposition to the entire nation, Essie made it clear that she would continue to stand by him, ensuring that he would never be alone. On September 5th, the day after the second riot, Paul Robeson, Howard Fast, and several victims of the violence held a press conference at the headquarters of the Council on African American Affairs in Manhattan. Newsmen jammed the room to hear 15 witnesses give their accounts and to hear Robeson explain that the concert had ended in violence because the police who were supposed to protect them attacked and assaulted them. He charged the police officers as fascist stormtroopers and accused Governor Dewey of complicity, demanding a federal intervention to restore law and order. He then added, with tears in his eyes, that he and his peers owed a great debt to the Jewish people, who stood there by the hundreds to defend him and the crowd who came out that day. Paul Robeson filed a federal suit against the veterans organizations and elected officials who participated in and permitted the Peekskill Riots to occur. Joined by Howard Fast, the Civil Rights Congress, and 25 others, they alleged the veterans planned to prevent the concerts and that the police had neglected or refused to protect the concertgoers. Another lawsuit was filed by other concertgoers in Westchester County, seeking compensation for their pain and suffering. Despite all their efforts, their suit was dismissed by the state Supreme Court, who ruled that they were deficient because statutory notices of claim had not been filed in advance. Paul Robeson's federal case, on the other hand, was upheld based on the decision in a similar case in California. But when that case was overruled by the Supreme Court, Robeson's federal suit would also be dismissed. Defeated but undeterred, Paul Robeson vowed to continue speaking out for justice, just as he had always done. The difference now, however, was that mainstream American society had cast him as persona non grata.
I met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name. Now do you call that a brother? No, no. You call that a brother? No, no. Call that a brother? No, no. Scandalize my name. I met my preacher the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he too scandalized my name. Now do you call that religion? No, no. You call that religion? No, no. You call that religion? No, no. Scandalize my name.
What I have done in applying for any passport is to obviously take the oath of allegiance, and that's all I will do.
Most importantly, however, were the questions raised by the State Department as to my political opinions. Here's a question of whether one who wants to sing and act can have, as a citizen, political opinions. And in attacking me, they suggested that when I was abroad, I spoke out against injustices to the Negro people in the United States. I certainly did. And the Supreme Court Justice just ruled, Judge Warren, in the segregation cases, that world opinion had a lot to do with that ruling, that our children, Negro children, can go to school like anybody else in the South. I'm very proud to have been a part of directing world opinion to precisely that condition.
Unable to leave the country to perform, Robeson's income plummeted, given that he was also unable to perform in most American venues. Having made an estimated $104,000 in the year 1947, his annual income in 1950 dropped to just $2,000. The Robesons were forced to sell their home in Enfield. With Robeson's career and livelihood destroyed, his legacy and achievements became the next target for American society to attack. Paul Robeson's record of being an All-American football player was erased, and an updated book on the All-America Review for college football. While Robeson was unable to speak to international audiences, the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover arranged for a reputation-destroying article titled Paul Robeson, the Lost Shepherd, to be printed and distributed in Africa. Scheduled TV appearances were canceled. His films, books, and music were pulled from distribution. Paul Robeson, the man who was at one time the most celebrated American celebrity in the world, was now the subject of a government-sponsored effort to ensure his social death.
The attempt of the enemy was to cut off the progressive people from the great masses of the Americans. In my own case, it was to cut me off
from the Negro people from whom I am born. Imagine, somewhere somebody says, I, born a Negro, that because of my beliefs, my fight for peace, my fight for friendship between nations, my fight for the complete liberation of my people, that somewhere I'm not an American and that I should be cut off from the very people from whom I was born.
Not only was I not allowed to go out, but I was also prevented from actually appearing in my own land. Concert halls were denied to me for many years. I was refused theaters. I have never been on American television, for example. That is, I've been blacklisted, as have many of my colleagues in America for whatever reason. As you saw the other day, Arthur Miller was in difficulty. But in many of our cases, it meant that we couldn't even, I have been able to practice my craft there. So I would say, no, you can't, I do not regret in any sense what I have done. I had, some of my friends feel I could have done things in other ways. One has to do them as one sees life. I regret, I can't even use the term regret. I'm very proud, in one sense, of any contribution I've been able to make to the struggles of my people. So if you want freedom, you have to suffer sometimes.
Fans and admirers of Paul still came out to support him when and where they could. Robeson was able to perform at the International Peace Arch on the border between the US and Canada. Roughly 40,000 people came out to hear Paul perform.
That we are gathered here today, that our government can understand that artists, not only myself, there are so many of us, so many scientists like Dr. Du Bois, one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, proudly a son of the Negro people, but one who has contributed to the advance of all mankind. And the idea that Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois cannot leave this country to attend peace meetings, to attend scientific gatherings all over the earth. And that goes for so many of outstanding American scientists, intellectuals, workers, trade union leaders, so that you must understand this. They will hear about this today. They will hear about our gathering here. This will mean a great deal to see that many of us may be able to travel in the future. And why do they take my passport away? They have said so in a case. They put it in a brief. They said that no matter what my political beliefs, what my standing among the Negro people of my own land in America, but they would have to take my passport away anyhow, because out of my own lips, mind you, from my own lips, for many years, I have been struggling for the independence of the colonial peoples of Africa. And that is meddling in the foreign affairs of the United States government. Now, that's just too bad, because I'm going to have to continue to meddle.
Robeson would also perform for an audience in London using the newly constructed transatlantic telephone cable. This concert was a historic moment, as Paul Robeson became the first artist to perform a live concert using this technology. A similar concert was performed for the miners of Wales, who Robeson had respected for many years.
My warmest greetings to the people of my beloved Wales, and a special hello to the miners of South Wales. It is a great privilege to be participating in this historic festival, and all the best to you as we strive toward a world where we all can live abundant, peaceful, and dignified lives.
His loophole international performance at the Canadian border, as well as his groundbreaking transatlantic cable concert, proved that in spite of his own career and legacy being erased in real time, he was still the same trailblazer that millions had come to love. On the strength of his dedicated supporters, Paul would make a defiant stand against the federal government in 1956, when he was summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee. No original recording is known to exist, but a performance of this event based on original transcripts was recorded, where Paul Robeson is played by another acclaimed actor, James Earl Jones.
My name is Paul Robeson. I live at 16 Jamel Terrace, New York City. I'm an actor and singer by occupation, and law on the side now and then.
Are you appearing today in response to a subpoena which was served upon you by the House Committee of Un-American Activities?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Robeson, Did you file a passport application on July 2nd, 1954?
Gentlemen, I have filed about 25 in the past few months.
When applying for this passport, were you requested to submit a non-communist affidavit?
Well, we discussed this very thoroughly with my counsel and with the State Department. And I was very precise in this, that under no conditions would I ever sign such an affidavit, that it is a complete contradiction of the rights of American citizens.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Oh, please, please, please.
Please answer, Mr. Robeson.
You know, I really thought I was here about some passport. Now, what do you mean by the Communist Party? As far as I know, it is a legal party like the Democratic Party and the Republican Party.
Was your Communist Party named John Thomas?
Mister, my name is Paul Robeson. And whatever I have had to say, I have said as Paul Robeson in public and all over the world, and that is why I'm here today.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Well, do you want to come into the ballot box with me when I vote and see?
You are directed to answer the question.
In 1946, in California, I stated for the record that I was not a communist. Since that time, I refused to answer that question, and I refuse now, Mr. Chairman, because my vote is nobody else's business.
You are directed to answer the question,
Mr.
Mr.
In the first place,
Robeson.
wherever I have been, and I've been to many places, the first to die in the battle against fascism had been the communists. And therefore, I have laid many a wreath on many a communist grave, and that, sir, is not criminal. In the second place, the Fifth Amendment has nothing to do with criminality, and therefore I invoke the Fifth Amendment. Mr. Walter, is it not?
Yes.
The Pennsylvania Walter, author of all those bills designed to keep all sorts of decent people out of this country?
No, only your kind.
You mean the colored people like myself in the West Indies and so on?
We are trying to make it easier to get rid of your kind, too. Mr. Robeson, are you a communist?
Well, I am not being tried here today as to whether or not I'm a communist. I am being tried for standing up and fighting for the rights of my people who are still second-class citizens in this country. You want to shut up every Negro who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people and for the rights of...
Mr. Robeson!
Sir, would you just please try to be fair with me? Who has the courage to stand up and fight for the rights of his people and for the rights of working people, sir? And I've stood in many a picket line for workers around the world and for your Pennsylvania steel workers, too. And that is why I'm here today. Would you just please let me read my statement?
Let me read a statement you made about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is the only country I have ever been in where I felt completely at ease.
I felt no prejudice as I am feeling here today.
What prejudice are you talking about? You were graduated from Rutgers valedictorian and Columbia Law School, and I remember seeing you play football at Lehigh.
Yes, we beat Lehigh.
Mr. Robeson.
That's right. Big Red was on my team. That's right.
I'd like to read a statement by Thomas Young, a Negro publisher. Mr. Robeson is now so far out of touch with Negro thinking and his everyday emotions, he can no longer speak authoritatively about or for the
Could I
rights.
please protest the reading of this? If you have Mr. Thomas Young here so that I can cross-examine him, and I can, okay. Otherwise, why can I not read my statement?
No, you may not. Why did you not stay in Russia, Mr. Robeson?
Sir, that is a very important question, because my father was a slave here. And I have many cousins who are sharecroppers here. I've never been able to measure my success just in terms of myself. And that is why my success has not meant all that it really should mean, really. And I've sacrificed literally thousands, if not millions of dollars for what I believe in.
No, the photographer's desist taking pictures. It's rather nerve-wracking.
No. It is quite all right because I am used to it. I've been in moving pictures, and I can pose, and I can smile. I just cannot smile, sir, when I'm talking with you.
The reason you're not in Russia, Mr. Robeson, is because you're promoting the communist cause in this country.
Can I please read my statement?
You cannot read that stuff.
I will say before this committee, you will not silence me in speaking out against the injustices done to my people.
Order.
You can brand me a communist, and I will still speak out. You can turn the Negro leadership against me, which you've done, and I will still speak out for justice for the Negro people. You can take away my passport, force me to live off the charity of my brother Benjamin, and I will still speak out.
Mr.
And even if you do finally
Robeson.
succeed in socially, economically, and politically assassinating me, so don't think you'll stop me, because it is not just me. It is the Negro people whom I echo.
Robeson.
And if you do succeed in silencing my voice by making me a non-person, there will be another voice, and another voice, and another voice.
I've been doing all of this that I can. The meeting is adjourned.
I think it should be.
A painter by the name of Rockwell Kent had been denied a passport repeatedly because he was alleged to have been a member of the Communist Party. Just like Paul Robeson, he refused to submit to a non-communist affidavit, even though he disavowed party membership. His case, Kent v. Dulles, made it to the Supreme Court, where they ruled that the right to travel was part of a citizen's right to liberty, which cannot be deprived under the Fifth Amendment. Kent, along with many others similarly deprived of their passports, now had them returned. Paul Robeson was now able to leave the United States.
Almost immediately, he was off on a triumphant world concert tour. Incredibly, he showed not bitterness nor resentment. It was a spectacular tour spanning England, Wales, France, and Russia. It was a standing room only affair wherever he went. The gentle warrior, the man of unbending principle, had returned.
Finally able to travel outside the US, the Robesons embarked on a world tour. During this tour, Paul Robeson would become the first person to perform at the Sydney Opera House while it was still under construction.
But I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And old man River, he'll just keep rolling along.
Paul Robeson, first celebrity to sing at Sydney's Opera House.
In the eyes of the public, Paul Robeson was back.
Distinguished as an actor, a singer, and recording artist for some 40 years now. Have you any thought of retirement?
Well, no. To speak very frankly, no. One of the reasons, of course, that retirement wouldn't particularly come in, you'll find that out as I begin my singing. I sing where I speak. For about 8 years, you know, it was very difficult for me to work in America. When I came back to London in 1958, I started again, played Othello, and been singing, TV and records, and doing pretty well.
After this tour, are you going to go back to the United States?
Well, I hope to be here for an extended tour, but as I just said before, one wonderful thing has happened. You must remember that with all the struggles, that I'm very proud to say, that the struggle has been won in my own case, in my own land, in America. And as I pointed out, I have just finished a long concert tour all over America, and as a matter of fact, if I hadn't gotten my passport, I would be now singing in the largest halls in America at the highest prices. So I intend to go back sometime.
Oh, Joe, here last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died.
On March 27, 1961, Essie received a phone call from Moscow. Her husband, Paul, had attempted suicide. Essie rushed to Moscow as quickly as she could and was informed that Paul had locked himself in his hotel room after an unusually wild party. While inside, he slashed his wrists with a razor blade. Paul was in such a paranoid state when he was first admitted to the Russian hospital that he believed the doctors around him to be spies, even accusing Essie of being a spy herself upon her arrival. The Soviet doctors believed he was suffering from a depressive paranoid psychosis, which was the result of a years-long private battle with his mental health now getting the better of him. While to most, Paul Robeson had seemed as strong and determined during his comeback tours he had always been, beneath the surface, all of the stress from being attacked, vilified, and robbed of his income and legacy was now too much to bear.
So what happened is he lands in Moscow, and there's film footage of him actively touring around Moscow for more than a week, looking fine. Well, relatively didn't look as good as he did 10 years earlier. Looks a little tired and older, but certainly vigorous. Speaking, lecturing, singing a little bit, all that, interviews on television. All of a sudden, on the 8th day, this happens. Long story short, there were many strange circumstances to that. When the dust settled, he recovered rapidly under the Soviet doctor's recommended treatment. In a week, he was on his feet, and a month later, he seemed fine to me when I left to go home. Strange circumstances, but whatever the circumstances were, whatever happened to him, the treatment that the Soviet doctors recommended and gave to him had almost a magical result. So their idea of what was wrong with him and what to do for him was certainly correct.
After recovering in Russia for 6 months, Paul, along with Essie, traveled back to London. Less than 48 hours later, Paul suffered another breakdown. Arrangements were made for Paul to enter the best psychiatric hospital in England, the Priory. Essie then called their old friend Helen Rosen, who had protected Paul during the first of the 2 Peekskill riots 12 years before, to be there for him during this difficult time.
And in Moscow, he cut his wrists. And one could see the scars. But he never talked about it.
He never mentioned it to you?
I used to feel them, and they were so obvious, the scars, but we never talked about it. I never brought up anything like that, and he sure didn't himself. It was all arranged. Essie had arranged it all with Paul's agent, Harold something, and his doctor to take him to the Priory.
Under the care of the doctors at the Priory, Paul Robeson was determined to have a rare chronic depression that warranted one of the only standard methods of treating mental disorders at the time, electroshock therapy. This would be the point of division within Robeson's close circle of friends and family.
When the dust settled there, he had had 54 electroshock treatments, which is outrageous by any standards then or now, and something that the Soviet doctors had said under no circumstances should a patient like this be subjected to shock. By our standards, it would be close to criminal. Nevertheless, without consulting the Soviet doctors, these folks in the Priory started him on electroshock within 36 hours of his admission. That seems strange to me. As a friend of mine used to say, a neighbor, something in the milk ain't clean.
You know, one last question about the breakdowns. Paul Jr. has a theory that the
shock treatment was too much.
Well, shock treatment also, that he was subject to conspiracy theories.
My opinion was what really happened is that he was subject to a drug hit by a CIA agent unknown at this wild party in his Moscow quarters, a drug called BZ, which was developed by the CIA under a program called MK Ultra.
They showered him with rays, and it was a deliberate. What do you think?
I think that's fanciful. Heaven knows I believe in conspiracies, but medically my husband was a very smart person, even though he was just an otologist. And he never saw any signs of that, and he went very carefully into the records at the Priory.
Shock treatment with the drugs he got tend to, in a sense, it's a mild form of lobotomy. You don't have any pizzazz to be political after they get through with that many shock treatments. So my thought is that at that hospital, which easily can be, at least in theory, it can easily be thought to have connections with MI5, etc., they simply zapped him enough to neutralize him in the hospital.
The suspicions of government surveillance on Paul Robeson during this time were legitimate. While in London, he was monitored by British MI5 and the FBI with the justification that his death would be publicized and used for communist propaganda. Government memos also revealed a desire to reject Paul's passport renewal on the grounds of his deteriorating mental health. This has fueled theories of government interference with Robeson's health for decades, theories that would be thoroughly investigated by Martin Duberman, Paul Robeson's biographer.
I went into writing the biography fully believing, I'd heard early on that it was a government conspiracy that destroyed both his career and his health. And knowing what our government has done, assassinating heads of state, etc., it didn't seem to me at all implausible that the government would have done that. But over the years, I talked to almost all of Robeson's doctors, both in the United States and abroad. They almost uniformly agree, I'm saying almost because I can't remember any exception, but there might be one, that Robeson had what is sometimes called a delusional depressive disorder and other times called a bipolar disorder. All of the doctors that I talked to said there's no need to look for a conspiracy theory here. The man had a depressive disorder, one that eventually turned out to be a severe disorder. So we don't need to bring in an outside government conspiracy as an explanatory device. My view is that without all of that, that the government nonetheless, in one sense, remains responsible for Robeson's collapse, because it was the government who exerted all of that pressure on him and destroyed his career, and did a very good job of making him a non-person. So finally, the government may well be responsible, even if it was not consciously, formally engaged in a conspiracy, meaning actually hiring doctors and giving them instructions to feed Paul an overdose of pills or to give him an excess of electric shock treatments which would finally destroy his brain.
Robeson's battle with bipolar depression, as well as his worsening circulatory and heart problems, had taken their toll on him. Paul would recover from his psychosis, but the effect it had on him was severe. Essie and Helen begged him to retire. He had done his share, they said, and after reclaiming his passport and having a successful comeback tour, he would be ending his career on a high note. For the first time in his life, he chose to back away from the spotlight in favor of much-needed rest. Just as Paul decided to step away from the public eye, the very movement he'd fought for his entire life would receive international recognition as hundreds of thousands of protesters marched on Washington to advocate for the civil and economic rights of African Americans.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
Just say how you feel to be back in the country.
Very glad to be back.
Clear the aisle, please. What are you going to do now, Mr. Robeson?
I'm going to be resting for a while.
Robeson, how do you feel about the civil rights movement here? Do you take any activity, any part in the civil rights movement at all?
I've been a part of that all my life.
Paul Robeson felt that he had been bypassed after many years of struggling to help forge the civil rights movement. All of his achievements had long ago been stripped from him. His successes were now only allowed to exist through those he had influenced, never to be credited to him.
People will so fight for their freedom that if it is not given to them, they will take it. The time has come when we must have our freedom. Not any 100 years, not any 50 years, not any 10 years. Now.
To bring about the complete independence of people of African descent here in the Western Hemisphere, and first here in the United States, and bring about the freedom of these people by any means necessary.
He was permitted only to have false notions, mischaracterizations, and regret be attributed to the name Paul Robeson. His health continued to deteriorate. He suffered a case of double pneumonia and a kidney blockage in 1965 that nearly cost him his life. The same year, Eslander Robeson, Essie, Paul's wife, manager, and closest friend, passed away from breast cancer 2 days before her 70th birthday. Paul would stay in retirement for the remainder of his life, living with his sister and her family in Philadelphia, watching the world passing by.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there.
Look in amazement to the front. I knew they had shot my husband.
On February 21st, while addressing a meeting of his followers, Malcolm X was shot down by Negro gunmen.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech.
You my opposer when I want freedom. You my opposer when I want justice. You my opposer when I want equality. You won't even stand up for me in America for my religious beliefs, and you want me to go somewhere and fight, but you won't even stand up for me here at home.
A battalion of U.S. 1st Air Cavalry clashes with North Vietnamese regulars in the central coastal plain near Bong Son.
Somewhere I read of the freedom of press.
Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, the man named as the source of the Pentagon copy that appeared in the New York Times, turned himself in today to federal authorities.
I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public.
It first appeared that the Marines had been sniped at and that a few houses were made to pay. Shortly after, an officer told me he had orders to go in and level the string of hamlets that surrounds Camney Village. And all around the common paddy field that feeds these hamlets, a ring of fire. 150 homes were leveled in retaliation for a burst of gunfire.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee.
Of course, all America is outraged at the assassination of an outstanding Negro leader. And America is also outraged at the looting and the burning.
Mr. Carmichael, do you see any change in atmosphere in the South? Do you think that we are approaching a more militant or revolutionary stage in the civil rights movement in the South?
Yes, I certainly think so. I think we're moving now into a political arena. And I think that what Negroes are now tampering in, what they're tampering with, will touch the entire country.
Do you think the formation of your party, the Black Panther Party, you are organizing a group in the South, which almost certainly will tend to contribute to violence, or at least counter-violence?
Well, they won't contribute to violence. They will just be seeking their political rights, and they will have to defend those rights.
The intermittent warfare between the Black Panthers and police erupted today in Los Angeles. There, a group of them, 3 women and 8 men, barricaded themselves in their headquarters and fought police with automatic weapons and hand grenades for 5 hours before surrendering.
Now, they will defend it the way the country defends its own rights. They will defend it the same way, violently.
The crisis expedited passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968.
Now, with this bill, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life.
On January 23, 1976, at the age of 77, Paul Robeson passed away. Friends, family, admirers, former critics, and strangers attended his funeral to pay their respects. Millions around the world mourned the loss of one of the greatest icons of the 20th century. On the surface, the mighty oak had long ago been cut down, replaced by an empty pasture. But to many, his impact was greater than the words, sounds, and images that had been erased. A prisoner in an Illinois penitentiary would describe Paul Robeson's legacy better than anyone, in only a few words.
They knocked the leaves from his limbs, the bark from his tree, but his roots were so deep that they are a part of me.
What a boy, where are you hiding? Now if you don't come, I'm gonna tell your daddy. There ain't no hammer that's on this mountain that rings like mine, boys, that rings like mine. I done bust this rock, boys, from here to Macon, all the way to the jail, boys. Yes, back to the jail. What a boy. Where are you hiding? Now if you don't come, I'm gonna tell your daddy.
Today, Peekskill hardly resembles the city that lashed out against Paul Robeson. Whereas long ago Peekskill fought to preserve its conservative values, every block of modern Peekskill showcases a thriving culture of artistic expression, reflecting many different eras simultaneously, including the very building that once housed the newspaper responsible for the riots of 1949. It would be completely understandable for someone to come to Peekskill and find it difficult to conceive that this was the same city that spearheaded a racist and anti-Semitic riot. When it has been discussed, it has often been twisted to hold Paul Robeson solely responsible, while diminishing Peekskill's involvement as much as possible. There is no greater example of this than in the name of the event itself, which has been the subject of intense debate. Despite the riots becoming internationally known as the Peekskill Riots after Peekskill veterans, inspired by the writings of the Peekskill Evening Star, committed violence which they doubled down on with the slogan "Wake Up America, Peekskill did," before planning a second protest in Peekskill City Hall, Peekskill suddenly refused to acknowledge that Peekskill had anything to do with it, and instead dubbed it the Robeson Riots. The narrative that Paul Robeson was to blame for the riots was already being circulated in the days, weeks, and months following the violence. Peekskill took pride in their so-called defense against communist subversion. Articles continue to be printed in the Peekskill Evening Star and other neighboring papers in defense of the veterans groups who participated in the riots. In a recurring spree of articles titled "Wake Up America, Peekskill Did," the staff devoted a significant section of their front page to defending their actions against an increasing wave of criticism, going as far as to say that it was a goal of the Communist Party to twist the Peekskill incident into a racial issue. On the same page, the American Legion announced that they were holding a minstrel show outside of Peekskill. The Peekskill Post of the Jewish war veterans faced severe criticism for their participation in both protest parades against Robeson, since many of their peers were responsible for much of the anti-Semitic hatred hurled towards the summer colonists and other concertgoers. Their continued involvement was further questioned after they themselves became victims of anti-Semitic harassment. In an attempt to defend the Jewish community of Peekskill, Samuel Slutsky, a local leader of the Jewish war veterans, would make a public statement.
Unfortunately, a good many of our community feel that all Jews are communists. This is a grave error. Religious Jews cannot be communists, since a communist is an atheist.
This would upset the Jewish community of Peekskill even more, since it seemed to play into the hysteria that had resulted in anti-Semitic disturbances targeting all Jews equally, whether they were leftist summer colonists or conservative Jewish businessmen. Another prominent Jewish leader in the community, Israel Ben Schreiber, whose own encounter with anti-Semitism in the region inspired him to establish the Putnam Valley Central School District, strongly opposed Slutsky's stance.
I want to reiterate here that I personally detest communism and all that it stands for. However, and I cannot stress this too much, the issue before us is not one of communism, but one of simple law enforcement, of the right of individuals to take the law into their own hands. I am strongly of the opinion that the answer to the challenge of the hoodlums who stoned the concertgoers and others is not to organize some such committee as Jews Against Communism, thereby implying that we are the right kind of Jew, but to insist that the law be enforced so that the lawlessness and violence which occurred at both concerts will never again take place in this vicinity. It seems to me that such an organization would only serve to split the Jewish community right down the middle, and that very likely those who tried to organize it would be caught in the squeeze. Nor can I forget the hoodlums who ran down Red Mill Road after the concert on Sunday, shouting, "You kikes are next," did not stop to ask which of the kikes were anti-communist.
Tensions between Peekskill's residents and the Jewish summer colonists had long simmered. The riots were when those tensions burst. They had grown to outnumber the full-year residents, providing a summertime boost to the economy of a region that had failed to replace its once prosperous manufacturing industries half a century earlier. But they were still viewed as outsiders. In addition, Paul Robeson's concert was promoted and organized almost exclusively for the left-wing Jewish families of these communities and for the benefit of the Civil Rights Congress. The growing culture of anti-communism nationally, combined with the unpopularity of Paul Robeson's crusade for civil rights, provided the spark to ignite the decades-long anti-Semitic hatred locally. And this didn't stop with the individual riots, as Peekskill men traveled to the homes of Jewish families within the colonies to harass and threaten them. This prompted the summer colonies to organize armed guards to protect their homes. But understandably, many families did not want to live this way. For them, the once beautiful and quiet Hudson River Valley had now become backward, vitriolic, and simply unsafe for them to remain in. So as the summer of 1949 came to an end, over 1,000 summer colonists announced their intentions to permanently leave. Preparations for a farewell party were underway, but in one more cruel act from the local government, the event was blocked by the town supervisor, Alan Grant, the same man who had proudly issued the permits for the veterans parades that had fueled the riots. His reasoning for canceling this event was a brand new ordinance restricting large public gatherings. Some believed this was too little too late, while others saw this as one final insult to hurt the already wounded communities in the aftermath of the two worst riots in the region's history, riots that he was among those responsible for. As the initial enthusiasm in support of the riots died down, criticism of the rioters became the majority narrative outside of Peekskill. This was aided by Howard Fast, who published his account of the riots in his book, Peekskill USA, a short time later. Not long after, this book became even more famous after he published his most famous work, Spartacus. New fans of his flocked to his other books, which included Peekskill USA, that would then be translated into different languages and circulated across the globe. The self-described friendly town now had an international reputation for barbarism.
When significant events are examined and documented, they can often be separated into two different categories: when the events are being described as ongoing or recent events, and when the events are being documented and presented as history. We don't often see what takes place in between, though, as focus on current events usually turns to newer stories, while historians come in and collect the primary sources from the first camp and begin to compile secondary sources that will become the historical account of what happened. The Peekskill Riots are no different, as the majority of documentation about it comes from the time when they were still occurring or just after, when it was still a recent memory. The historiography of the Peekskill Riots has warped much of what is discussed about it today, but how that came to be is still somewhat unknown and undocumented. There is, however, one moment, never before seen, which in the greater story of the Peekskill Riots is, admittedly, not a significant moment, but provides an amazing insight into when the Peekskill Riots fell from a national news story into the hands of local historians, now the only arbiters of the majority of primary sources. So, how did the first wave of historians treat the story?
5 years after the Peekskill Riots, former Peekskill mayor and city historian William Horton was writing a book about the history of Peekskill. He reached out to several local organizations to provide information about them, such as their history, membership, and list of accomplishments. This included veterans posts of the American Legion, veterans of foreign wars, Jewish war veterans, and Catholic war veterans, all of whom had participated in the riots years prior. These entities responded with mostly benign submissions. However, in the archives of the Peekskill Field Library, a draft of the Catholic war veterans' history includes the following sentence.
Much might be made of the participation of the post in the protest parades at the time of the Robeson concerts, if the histories of the other local veterans organizations make similar mention.
In the transcripts, this sentence is crossed out. In the published book, the surrounding paragraphs were included, with this brief mention of their protest against Paul Robeson omitted, indicating that other veterans organizations chose not to disclose their participation in the riots. The site of the second and larger riot was turned into a drive-in movie theater. While this had been planned before Robeson's appearance in the area, the same veterans organizations that had protested Robeson's concert attended its grand opening. Their participation was a symbolic act that ushered in a new era. From this moment forward, the Peekskill Riots were now history, and Peekskill's treatment of this history was one of thorough suppression and manipulation of facts. Teachers at Peekskill High School who dared to mention the riots were summoned to the principal's office and told that complaints had been made about them upsetting and exciting the children unnecessarily. Librarians at Peekskill schools during this time refused to allow students to read the Peekskill Evening Star articles which had incited the violence.
For decades afterwards, the secrecy only increased. Peekskill historians relentlessly harassed journalists who exclusively refer to the events as the Robeson Riots, and audio interviews with eyewitnesses from this period contain suspicious gaps and cuts. The following audio is from a 1980 interview with a veteran who participated in the second riot.
He sang this time.
He sang, and I can remember him saying something about the rabble up on the road, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But when that thing broke up,
yeah. Was it hours and hours that passed?
It was at least.
Did it start in the morning and then ended at night, or was it in the afternoon and ended in the evening?
I think it was scheduled for 1 o'clock or something like that in the afternoon, and it was about 5 or 6 before they were all broke up. When they were coming out of there, right? And this is as late as 1947 when we had that big snowstorm. I don't know whether you remember that. You're probably
too young. Too young. I was just a kid.
But it was really a big snowstorm. That was before everybody had a snowplow in their Jeep.
The change in attitude towards the riots was made even easier by the fact that the rioters and their supporters assumed prominent positions in city and state governments. District Attorney George Finelli, who failed to prevent both riots yet was tasked with investigating them, would be made a New York State Supreme Court Justice in 1957. Assistant District Attorney Leonard Rubenfeld had also been a prominent leader in the Jewish war veterans and was involved in the first of the two riots. He too would eventually become a state Supreme Court justice and would share his version of the events years later.
It was an innocent march to demonstrate the opposition of the veterans to communism. The DA wasn't pleased that I'd been involved in the first incident. Peekskill got a name for bigotry that it didn't deserve.
Other rioters and supporters followed this trend, while those in power who had stayed silent before continued to stay silent, such as town supervisor for neighboring Putnam Valley, Harry Sillick. Having been town supervisor for decades without interruption, he had permitted a meeting of the Peekskill Ku Klux Klan to take place on his family farm years prior, and he had also permitted the Veterans Parade before the second Peekskill riot to begin in the business district of Putnam Valley, before marching to the concert site in Cortland. Yet when his citizens both exalted and deplored the violence, he stayed silent. The culture of the rioters and their enablers retained control. What this meant for Peekskill's future would shape the region for generations to come.
Now America is a land of mighty cities, and much of our space has been transformed into urban density. To be fully dynamic, the American city must now accommodate the automobile. This is the vital factor of our new age. It is responding by providing adequate, well-located parking facilities, often building skyward to create the urgently needed space. The density of all real estate, wherever it exists, stems directly from the primitive horse and buggy plan, and skyscrapers themselves are no exception. The contrast of 1880 and the present is becoming a common sight. From now on, we shall be seeing much demolition, the first step in making our cities better places to work, better places to live. It will take great effort and real leadership, but as a people we can do the jobs. Often the substance of our urban structures is such as to resist the power of the demolition hammer. As a people, however, we are steadfast as we tackle problems, and our progress is certain to be steady as we clear away the structures that block progress.
Urban redevelopment projects had been going on throughout the United States in cities like Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Boston, and New York City. The Housing Act of 1949 gave birth to the Federal Urban Renewal Program, which provided grants to cities in need of redevelopment. At the time of the Peekskill riots, the rate of substandard housing was not only higher than the state average, but double the county average, making it one of the worst places to live in Westchester County. The primarily blue-collar, working-class populace lived and worked in deteriorating buildings that had been built in the 1800s when Peekskill was still a village. This is what fueled support for urban renewal in the late 50s. But even then, observers noted that the city was also hoping to renew Peekskill's image after the riots. As real estate thrived in other cities in Westchester, realtors and home sellers understood that Peekskill's image was still that of a tough, blue-collar, right-wing community, which placed Peekskill homes lower on the price list. Whereas urban renewal was nationally a Democrat-led effort, in Peekskill, it was pushed forward by Republicans. The newspaper that spearheaded the racist and anti-Semitic riots a decade prior now championed progressive change. The city that, for the first half of the century, fought to retain its rural village character, suddenly wanted to modernize it as fast as possible. Thus, Peekskill became the first city in New York State to receive funding for urban renewal. They selected neighborhoods deemed to have higher than average numbers of substandard housing and relocated the families living in these areas to new apartment buildings. Critics of urban renewal, in Peekskill and in many other cities in America, quickly recognized a pattern of non-white neighborhoods being the first ones to be selected for relocation and demolition.
A boy last week, who was 16 in San Francisco, told me on television, thank God we got him to talk, maybe somebody will start to listen. He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called the Negro problem. These are Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says and don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
But now, Jim...
No, am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
Peekskill's first target for demolition was the Academy Street neighborhood, which was home to much of Peekskill's black populace. 150 families were displaced, and 121 structures were obliterated. This destruction mirrored other urban renewal efforts in cities throughout the country. The clear racial undertones in these demolitions contributed heavily to the rise of racial tensions in the late 1960s, which would spark riots across the United States. Peekskill experienced this as well, albeit on a smaller scale. Vandalism and arson took place on numerous occasions, culminating with the murder of a black teenager by a white bar owner. Despite eyewitnesses testifying that the bar owner killed the child in cold blood, he was found not guilty.
First of all, there was this headline here, tavern owner held in slaying of youth 17. Again, I don't want to get greatly into the details, but a black man came into the bar, demanded some beer, and apparently didn't have the proper identification, was asked to leave. They carried the argument out into the street. Apparently some kind of threatening weapon was flashed or something like that, and the victim wound up being shot 3 times fatally. This led the following day to this headline, riot brings curfew here. Windows of 25 stores are smashed or broken. And you see from the drama of the photographs, which are all from the Evening Star collection also, you see this is an evening scene here with police on the street with shotguns and tear gas. And again, this was a very serious situation. Many windows were broken, and the word riot is used. Now, first of all, I want to clarify, I know everyone here probably does understand, but since we're being videotaped, I want to emphasize once again that these are the real Peekskill riots. The so-called Robeson riots, which occurred in 1949 in the town of Cortland, were specifically in Van Cortlandville. And so people who are interested in the history of that event are encouraged to go out to the town of Cortland and research the history of Van Cortlandville. And because we do get many calls via the internet and telephone asking about the so-called Peekskill riots when they're actually referring to the Robeson riots in 1949.
Peekskill's urban renewal is never discussed in the context of the Peekskill Riots story, but urban renewal completely changed the way Peekskill looked at itself and its history. In other cities, urban renewal primarily hurt non-white citizens, but did produce modernized neighborhoods and economies for its white populace. Peekskill's urban renewal was so poorly managed, however, that it devastated the entire city, setting it on a downward spiral. By the late 70s, Peekskill had destroyed 350 structures and displaced over 1,000 people. Local leaders were successful in tearing down significant portions of the city, but failed to fill these now vacant lots with homes or businesses. This upended their already struggling economy and culture in ways that Peekskill, even today, still has not fully recovered from. The upheaval of urban renewal sparked a wave of nostalgia for the old Peekskill, a romanticized depiction based on images and faint memories of its former small village character. This is all the more ironic when, upon further examination, it is understood that urban renewal was started because of the poor living conditions of old Peekskill, and the negative reputation the city earned after their attacks on Paul Robeson's concerts became the subject of international coverage. Despite urban renewal being a strong point of focus locally, the role of the 1949 riots in this era has been largely unaccounted for. But urban renewal, both in its conception and in its aftermath, went hand in hand with local efforts to suppress and erase the story of the Peekskill Riots.
The Peekskill Riots story is now an under-discussed, if not forgotten chapter in history. Its relevance to events before and after demonstrate that history does not necessarily repeat, as history never stops. Many other similar events are now being recontextualized, from just being viewed as isolated occurrences to being a part of a larger history of white supremacy in the United States.
The Klan, or whoever it was, jumped out and just started shooting in the direction of the thickest concentration of people.
Help us! Help us! Help us! The state protects the Klan, and this makes it clear. They came through and they opened fire. They opened fire on us.
White groups attacked and destroyed Tulsa, Oklahoma's prosperous African-American neighborhood known as Greenwood, or Black Wall Street.
In the course of less than 24 hours, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground by a white mob who were assisted by the Tulsa Police Force and the National Guard.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets! Our streets!
Fucking hit us just now. There are people, bodies laying on the ground right now.
Neo-Nazis started this. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me, they didn't put themselves down as neo, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Oh, this is terrible. Killing thousands, trying desperately to keep these people back. The police are fighting the cops, and they are beating up a Negro. They're beating up, not clubbing them, they're clubbing them.
The Peekskill Riots are an instructive example of how systems of power lash out against their detractors, directly and indirectly. When under attack, oppressive structures retaliate with direct violence. However, these structures operate in more subtle and indirect ways as well, by rewriting and suppressing history to their advantage. This makes it so that the status quo is not only preserved, but any and all critics are deterred from speaking out against it. The Peekskill Riots were an attack on the Black and Jewish concertgoers who represented change in a region that had been dominated by white conservatives for generations. The local powers tried to erase this story. First, by attempting to revitalize Peekskill as a progressive city through urban renewal. When that failed, the history was rewritten again to preserve the image of old Peekskill. Paul Robeson was an intellectually gifted man who was raised by his father to be a skilled communicator and orator. His once-in-a-generation talents as a performer, combined with his knowledge of different cultures and languages, made him an international star, providing him the base and means to propel his activism to heights that no one had ever reached before. This made him a threat to the powers that be. By attacking him, they destroyed the man, but by erasing him, they destroyed the legacy of Paul Robeson. His words faded away. His achievements, his example, his inspiration were stolen from generations then and now. History is many things, but it is not linear. Progression and evolution are not guaranteed, and in the story of the Peekskill Riots, the events that took place, those involved, and the treatment of its history afterwards prove that what once happened can be made to be as though it never happened. The consequences of this are ones that millions of people live with every day, as the systems of injustice that allowed the Peekskill Riots to occur still maintain power today. The examples of figures such as Paul Robeson are desperately needed, as modern-day activists continue the fight he sacrificed everything to uphold. When events such as these, and those who were there, are left out of our history books, we are setting ourselves up to endure them again. But what can we do? We can't stop it. We've seen it happen again and again, but we can't not do anything either. Many who were there in Peekskill are no longer with us, and one day, there will be no one left. Their experiences are and will be our own if we do not listen. But even if they cannot speak to us directly, their words, so long as they are preserved, transcend time. In the immediate aftermath of the riots in 1949, many victims composed a report titled Eyewitness, documenting their experiences during the two riots. Along with these accounts, they presented the reader with a warning. We who submit this report to you are residents of the area. We have built our homes here. We send our children to its schools. We have sunk our roots and our happiness deep into the soul of this lovely Hudson Valley.
These things which you will read about happened to us. We cannot run away from them or forget them because this is where we live. This is where we still hope to build our future.
The young lad who carries the mail in our village, the lad who has smiled and greeted me every morning for 3 years, was a member of the howling mob which attacked the first Robeson concert.
The barber, who has cut our children's hair for 16 years, boasts proudly that he helped organize the stoning of cars as they left the second concert.
The girl who was my best friend in school told me I deserved the rock hurled at my face because I went to hear Robeson sing in Peekskill.
We send you this report as a warning. Please, don't delude yourselves with the thought that what happened in our communities could never happen in your town. That was our attitude before August 27th. Now, we know better. Now, we are alerted.